First off, I really hate mics, so if I drop it down, you gotta tell me. If I get it too close, you gotta tell me. I come from the labor movement, so I'm used to hand signals, but I prefer this or this, but you've seen some other ones. What Teresa didn't say, and I guess I'll back up a minute. When she asked me to come down here, this is not the normal community that I speak to. If you want a political speech, I can give one. If you want a motivational speech and you're a bunch of union members that have forgotten to be activists, I can give that speech. But I had to think about the commonality and how this a homegrown economy relates to the labor movement. But before I do that, I need to tell you a little more about me and a little more about the labor movement. I am a third generation union thug, and I'm very proud of that. My grandfather organized the Milwaukee Road Railroad when he was 15 years old. He was a Gandy dancer, and if you don't know what that is they were the guys that hung on ropes off the bridges and painted. My mother sued a school district in 1950 to get equal pay with single men. And for that privilege, after she got married and got pregnant, which if you know the 50s and the 60s, women weren't allowed to teach if they were pregnant, so she lost her job. And that school district blackballed her when she became eligible to teach again. So for the next 7 years before we moved out of that town, she drove 30 miles each way to a small Minnesota community and taught school there. My idea, I listened to some of your earlier presenters, and they talked about finding their voice. I found my voice when I was 3 years old. I was dragged down the street in Minnesota as we talked to people in a pretty conservative town about politics. I found my labor voice when I was 5 and my mother went back to work because we were a working class family. I've always been middle class. I can't tell you that we suffered, but I can tell you that we didn't have enough money in a 2-parent working family that I could just sit in a daycare. So when my father wasn't pipelining, his idea of childcare was wherever he was working on a house, I was his 5-year-old hod carrier. If you don't know what a hod carrier is, that's the guy that carries the concrete blocks over and sets them up on the table. I didn't get this big by accident. So, you know, my mother took me to union meetings from the time I was a small child. And I'm very proud to say that my youngest son is a Billings firefighter, so he's the 4th generation union thug. Our whole basis of life is collective action. That's what unions do. That's what I've been taught since I was a child. So what I see here is energy that wants to come together collectively to do something good for your community. I understand that. I may have some different opinions and perspectives, which I'm going to share in a moment, about what you have to respect and understand as you change your economy. But the idea of activism and how we get there, you can't have your voice without, I think this gentleman talked about political power. The labor movement has been very successful. You need to understand that. We believe in good wages and benefits. We believe you deserve respect and dignity at work. And we believe you should be able to go to work and come home with all of your digits or not have to die on the job. And so our membership over the last 100 years have become rooted in your communities. Where you take Billings, there is 800 United Steelworkers in 3 different refineries here. And some of you have opinions that think that would be, this community would be better without those refineries. There are 1,000 more United Steelworkers in the mine at Stillwater in Columbus and Nye. Those people, when you talk about keeping and internalizing your economy and where wealth goes, and I know some of the presenters took a different perspective than me, those refinery workers put $100,000 a year each into this community. The miners do the same thing. So when you change your economy, you should keep that in mind. But let's talk about where the commonality is. Trevor, where are you still in the room, Trevor? You brought up a great point. In 1941, 65% of the ag produced in Montana, I think you said, was consumed here. Every community in this state had some type of meat production facility, a processing plant. And I would argue that 90% of them were union. I would argue that there's people in this community today, and I don't know, I mean, I think the last meat plant that I remember closing in Billings was probably in the 1990s. There are people in this community today living on the pensions that they earned in those meat packing plants. Every dairy in this state, you know, as far as I know, Medigold and Darigold, the larger ones, are still union. They pay great wages and they're part of the community. But we talk about why things have changed. There is one law in Montana that makes that happen. Montana sells its milk by a sell-by date. Huge corporations come in every year, Albertsons, all sorts of places, and want it, every legislature, and want to move that to a use-by date. Because if they go to a use-by date, they can ship the milk in from Utah. And, you know, if you don't want to, you know, export your economy, those are the simple little things that make a difference. I need to look at my notes, because as I said, this is not something I do on a regular basis. The labor movement has changed dramatically, and our communities have changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And when Teresa and I were speaking this morning, I used the line that when we internationalized the economy, it was devastating to our communities. It was devastating to the labor movement as well. If you study our movement, we've had a reduction in membership of somewhere around 30% of the workforce in the private sector, down to about 9% now. And what that has done is we've offshored all of our jobs, is it has created communities that are economically poor. And it has created huge disparities in the economy. But I thought of this after you and I talked, Teresa. 25 years ago, there was a friend of mine, his name was Frank McKenna. He was a union wrestler, a union butcher, and a union musician. And he, wow. When I came to Great Falls in '79, I watched what happened with the loss of the smelter. And I thought, you know, God, this is awful. And I said, you know, how did this happen? And he said, this happened 15 years ago. And I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? He said, when we quit negotiating with local people, and they started shipping in corporate, you know, leaders from out of state to negotiate these contracts, that was when we lost the smelter. And so that was the first thing I thought of. When you talk about a local economy, if we're dealing with local people, unions are not your enemy. I mean, we need to find common ground where we can talk about how do we make sure workers are treated correctly, how do they have dignity, how do they make a living wage, have benefits, and how do they go home safe. And I would rather do that with every person in this room than I would with the people I usually negotiate with, or used to negotiate with when I was with the operating engineers, because they all flew in from out of town. And they were all leaving, and they weren't invested in the community. And Frank's point was, he said, we lost, he said, up until the point they started flying them in, we went to the same churches, we went to the same schools, our kids played on the same Little League teams, and we had a common value to make our community strong. And so when you go to a point and you can internalize the economy, I think you bring us back to the point where whether we're representing unions or businesses or other organizations in the community, we have a common goal and a common value of making our community better. The other thing I think I would want to share, and I'm going to miss some notes because I know I'm running out of time, but in this community, you know, for those of you that have small businesses and that you support, your organizations support small businesses, we have the ability to talk to our members and let them know about the value of shopping locally, of being, you know, part of the community, and so we need to make that connection. But our leadership, I'm going to tell you the truth, are so overwhelmed in the fight they have just to maintain the right to collective bargaining that you're going to have to reach out to them. And then I have to say this with regard to your comment with Costco versus the local tire dealer. Yesterday I put new tires on my work car. I bought them from a local shop. It was a hard decision for me because, and this is the difference of our values, it was a very hard decision for me because Costco will let us organize and will not fight us. They pay pretty decent wages for the industry they're in. And I want you to know that the dealership I went to across the street from the Labor Temple in Great Falls has, you know, I've known them for 30 years, they're my friends, but they would vote to eliminate the right to collective bargaining in a heartbeat. And we have to, you know, and they literally, every time I come in, and they have people working for them that need social services in order to feed their kids and make sure they have health care. And they have their workers convinced to every time I walk in there, and I mean, it's a long story. I mean, I like Mark, the guy that owns it, we have an ongoing dialogue, but he has his workers that are on social services convinced that they should harass me about the fact that we've kept an Obama sign on the front of that Labor Temple since 2008. You know, and I can tell you that if you're not voting for policies that allow us to continue to be a labor movement, we will be your enemies. If you are supportive of that, we won't be. But we will never, ever give away our right to collective bargaining. Thank you.